once again, I'm delighted to introduce our NCSC board member, Dr. Rita Caldwell, who will be introducing our luncheon speaker.
Thank you, David. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, and I'm going to give information about our speaker that you may or may not know, which I think you will find interesting. First of all, I'm introducing him as Dr. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House of Representatives, because he has a bachelor's degree in history from Emory University and his PhD from Tulane, studying European history. What is interesting about Newt Gingrich is that his first engagement in civic affairs was speaking to a city council in his native Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to say why the city should establish a zoo. He's written the introduction to the book America's Best Zoos. He's a dinosaur enthusiast, and the New Yorker has referred to him as someone who has retained his enthusiasm for these interesting animals. I would also like to point out that he was a professor at West Georgia College, and in the Department of Geography, he was instrumental in establishing an interdisciplinary environmental studies program. I'm sure many of us did not know that. He's authored or co-authored 18 nonfiction books, including a book on environmental science titled A Contract with Earth, that was written jointly with Terry Maple and published by the Johns Hopkins University Press. He's written about 10 history novels and other books, particularly focused on the Civil War, the Pacific War series, the Revolutionary War, etc. So I find that it's important to introduce you to Dr. Gingrich today by mentioning a personal anecdote. When I first met him and talked with him, I was very enthusiastic and energetic and convincing him that we had to double the NSF budget. And he said, no, we don't. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's terrible. He said, Rita, we have to triple the NSF budget. So I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Newt Gingrich.
Well, let me just say, first of all, thank you very much, Rita. I appreciate it. And one of the major mistakes I made in my speakership was that we doubled NIH without, in parallel, tripling NSF. And you needed a larger increase in NSF because it's off of a smaller base. And so much of what we think of as health research relies on mathematics, computing, chemistry, physics, that to think only in terms of biological knowledge as the centerpiece of NIH is to completely misunderstand it. And one example, I'm a fanatic on brain research and the potential of brain research to change everything. And I would argue as a fiscal conservative that breakthroughs on things like Alzheimer's, autism, et cetera, are the only way in the long run that you're going to ever balance the federal budget, because you'll never overcome the inevitable consequences of aging without very dramatic breakthroughs in our knowledge understanding of the brain. Well, it turns out that because of the sheer complexity of the human brain and the volume of data we're starting to gather, you need 2 or 3 generations of breakthroughs in computing to have the speed and storage capacity that is going to be able to cope with the scale of information flow that is going to come out of neurosciences over the next 10 or 15 years. Now, that's not an obvious thing. And so you've got to really think broadly about the scientific enterprise. But I'm going to try to be very practical and very candid for a couple minutes, and then toss it open, and I think they have some method to get questions up here and all that. First of all, I am honored to be here, and I realize that particularly with all of the changes of the last few days, that, having a right-wing Republican show up is probably not what all of you had signed up for when you came. And let me just give you an example. How many of you have some level of anxiety about the new administration? Just raise your hand. Well, let me tell you a story. I was invited last September to one of the very cool things the Canadians do, which is called the Monk Debates. And the Monk Debates, about once a year, they invite 2 people on each side, and they have 3,000 or 4,000 people who show up, and you debate a topic. And last year's topic, of course, was Trump versus Clinton. And they have them all vote before the debate, and then they vote after the debate. And before the debate, it was 86% Hillary and 14% Trump. And after the debate, because Laura Ingraham and I were so effective, it was 80% Hillary and 20% Trump, which the Canadians thought was an astonishing achievement. I mean, they're all going, wow, I can't believe you did that. But my opening line for the 86% was, look, if I were a Canadian, I'd be worried too. I mean, you have a guy running around saying he wants to put America first. You have no idea precisely what that means. Our 2 economies are interchangeable, and we are the elephant, and you are the chipmunk. And if we roll over wrong, you're in big trouble. And so that at least got him to relax and go, gee, he shares the same reality. So let me tell all of you a little bit of this. And I've spent a lot of time working with Trump, studying Trump, trying to understand Trump. I've just finished the 8th of 9 speeches I'm giving on Trump and Trumpism. 8 of them will be at Heritage Foundation, and 1 was at the National Defense University. And the core bottom line is that I can't tell you what he'll do tomorrow because he can't tell you what he'll do tomorrow. But it's not because he's stupid. For those of you who have any interest in the guy who's going to be your president for at least 4 and maybe 8 years, I really recommend 2 of his books. One is The Art of the Deal, and the other is The Art of the Comeback. And they both give you a sense of how he operates, how he thinks, what he does, and the speed with which he learns. And that's one of my reasons for coming here today. You can hunker down and decide that you want to be oppositionist and that you're going to hate everything and life will be terrible. Or you can say, you have been born into one of the great magic opportunities in American life. The fact is, science and technology are going to continue to evolve at an astonishing rate. Those of you who have been active in science for more than 20 or 25 years know that there are things we do today that in speed and capability were unthinkable when you were in graduate school. And, by the way, when my 2 grandchildren, who are now 15 and 17, get out of graduate school, they will be doing things that are currently unthinkable. And this pattern is absolutely unavoidable. For any of you who've never looked at it, I really recommend Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave, which is now almost 40 years old. But his essential argument is we're moving from an information age, from an industrial age to an information age, and it is big a change as moving from an agricultural era to an industrial era, or moving from hunting-gathering to agriculture. Well, if you take that fairly seriously, you're talking about an enormous, ongoing, unending process of change. Furthermore, if you read 2 of the last paragraphs on the next, I just did a speech on the president's inaugural address. If you look at the last 2 paragraphs just before he gets to the closing, he talks about the scale of opportunity. He talks about space. He talks about medicine. He's talking about science and engineering and technology. And part of the challenge here is for you to feed it back to them and say, look, if you want to achieve these goals, this is the kind of investment you have to make. Now, I would argue that there are a lot of things we can do better than we're currently doing them. I would argue that there's some legitimate questions about how we do certain things. I personally believe the scale of philanthropy you're going to see in the next 20 years is so large that you shouldn't get up in the morning and say, how much money do I get in a government grant? And that's the end of the world. You should get up in the morning and say, there are 3 zones here. What's going to happen in the for-profit world? What's going to happen in the philanthropy world? And what's going to happen in the government world? And each of them is going to have different strengths and different weaknesses. But I've just spent some time talking with Mark Zuckerberg about their new personal foundation that he and his wife are creating. $3 billion is the starting point. Well, it's not everything you want in life. But $3 billion here, $3 billion there, you begin to get real money. If you look at space, I would argue all of the most exciting things being done to accelerate exploration of space are being done by private sector billionaires, because they're not constrained. They don't have to worry about the Congress. They don't have to worry about federal rules. They don't have to worry about long planning horizons. And they can fail. When they fail, they go, well, what the heck? And they go to the next topic. The Wright brothers took 500 experiments to fly. It took them 5 summers. They were doing it as a personal hobby. They couldn't get any money out of the government. The Smithsonian had $50,000, and it was spending it on a very elaborate project, but wouldn't help them. So each flight cost $1. On December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers get up in the morning, have a tent, make coffee, and they fail 4 times. On the 5th flight that day, they fly a distance shorter than the wingspan of a Boeing 747 at a speed slow enough that one brother can run along next to the plane to make sure it doesn't cartwheel and kill the other brother who's flying it. And they've flown. 2 years later, in 1907, or 3 years later, in 1907, this is December, so the summer of 07, they fly around the island of Manhattan, and 1.5 million people see an airplane for the first time. That's how fast it accelerated. Would you like to be the person who goes into the congressional hearing to explain the 400th failure? This is a huge problem. It's a big problem in our space program. We're way too timid. We take too few risks. We spend too much time thinking, too little time doing. And so partly what I want to suggest to you is, nobody understands what Trumpism is, including Trump. It's an intuition, it's a general direction, it's an attitude, it's not a plan, this is not like Reagan. Reagan had a very long period. He was an active anti-communist from 1947. He was an active conservative by the late end of the 1950s. He ended up as governor of California for 8 years. He ran for president and lost. By the time he arrived, he had spent 33 years getting to be president. And Heritage produced 2,200 proposals in a 1,900-page book that 275 people contributed to. Totally different model. This is a singular entrepreneur who on his own beat 16 people, then turned around, beat the elite media, and beat a woman who had $1 billion and was the presumptive next president. And now he's caught, I told me that he didn't just catch a bus, he caught a convoy. And they're going to be inventing things. And if you go in aggressive enough and articulate enough and have thought it through enough, you're going to shape large parts of this administration. Because they know the general direction they want to go in. They don't know how to do it. They have attitudes. They distrust bureaucracy in general. They distrust red tape. They hate regulations. But they don't have a plan for any specific thing. Furthermore, one of the great strengths of our system of government is that the Congress does have weight. The reason the Founding Fathers made Article 1 the Congress, not the President. And all of you have an opportunity now to have a conversation with your House members and your senators in what's going to be a very open dialogue. And I'm going to say 2 things that you might find controversial, and then I'd love to take questions because I really think you can direct me in terms of comments. 1, there is nothing wrong with having to explain and defend what you do. In a free society, it is totally legitimate. When I helped double NIH while we balanced the federal budget, the only 4 consecutive federal budgets in your lifetime, I presided over shaping. And we consciously were frugal in many things, but we put an extra $1 billion into intelligence, and we put a lot of money into NIH. But that doesn't mean we don't have the right to question every dollar. It doesn't mean we can't say, aren't there ways that we could be doing that better? Aren't there old habits and old structures and old systems? Haven't we got sort of sloppy in certain areas? That's totally legitimate. And so part of your attitude ought to be, what are the things you're prepared to defend? What are the things that you believe policymakers should know? And what are the projects that are important enough and large enough that the nation should be committed to it? And what are the projects that are important enough but not that large that philanthropists should be involved in it? We have the other side of all this acquisition of wealth is you have the largest number of wealthy people capable of creating foundations and capable of investing in the history of the human race, and the amount of assets they have is staggering. And many of them are going to spend it. I mean, I honestly believe that the billionaires who are going into space may well do more than government in the next 10 to 15 years to accelerate the speed at which we do things. They have that much resources, and they're that unconstrained. Well, the same thing is going to be true in health research. And it turns out a lot of the guys who are getting really, really rich at 32 don't like the idea of dying. And they're willing to spend a lot of money on not dying. So if you're operating in a zone of not dying, you're going to have lots of money. The same thing is going to be true, I think, for people who want a decent environment. You're going to find a lot of this. So think about 3 zones. What can be done for profit that sustains itself because it's making a profit? What can be done by philanthropies? And what should be done by government? And I think you'll find an ecosystem of knowledge and an ecosystem of research and development dramatically bigger and dramatically richer and dramatically more dynamic than anything we've ever seen. So I'm an optimist about that phase. The second point I want to make is very simple. We are at a crisis in civic education for, I think, a number of different reasons. One of them is the decay of schools. So we have a lot of people who don't know anything. I mean, you can go and ask them questions. We have people 22 years old who don't know who George Washington is. So you shouldn't expect them to understand much about science either. Part of it's the popular culture. You can now entertain yourself playing computer games or watching sitcoms, and you don't have to learn anything. So we've really become very different than the world that Rita and I grew up in. Much more unstructured. We really need a national dialogue, if you will, a national debate, on the importance of knowledge, on the importance of science, on the fact that everything we rely on for modern civilization has its roots in scientific knowledge and engineering and in technology. That without these 3 great drivers, we would just collapse overnight. But can be an extraordinarily exciting moment. I mean, one of the reasons, frankly, I'd like to see us do some very bold things is I want to send signals to young people that life can be exciting, that there's something for them to invest themselves in, that they can be involved in great adventures. And whether those adventures are under the sea, or those adventures are in a laboratory, or those adventures are in space, I just want to reestablish the notion that this is exciting and it's worth learning and it's worth the time, because you can create a much better future. And that's a real problem. We have far too few students today who have caught the sense of excitement and who are willing to invest the time and energy in courses that are difficult and in topics that require them to spend long hours. And so this can be a great opportunity for us as a country. We have to have this conversation because these things are central to our future. And I think you will find that the total investments will remain massive. I mean, during periods when we downsize the military, people come running in and they're all anxiety-ridden. And I try to point out to them, on occasion, we downsize our military so it is only 10 times bigger than the second largest in the world. And while that's a little smaller than we like, it's very hard to argue that we are in any danger. The same thing is true of the scientific establishment. We will invest in the next 10 years far more than anybody else on the planet. And we'll invest it in a multitude of ways, and the opportunities in science and in technology and engineering will be enormous. And 10 years from now, we'll be doing things that you couldn't dream of today, because the rate of invention and the rate of the diffusion of invention is going to be that dramatic. So I'm delighted to be here, and Rita, I'll be glad to take questions. We can share.
Sure. I think the majority of the questions are about climate change. They're really very, very concerned about can we address climate change and grow the economy and create jobs? And how do we communicate? Give us some advice on how do we communicate that to the president?
Well, hey, I'm not quite sure. Okay. This is an administration which is committed to a series of policies which cut across the primary principles or mantras of climate change. So, for example, he's going to be much more favorable to West Virginia coal than anybody in the Sierra Club can stand. That's a fact. I mean, you can decide you want to focus on that and fight over it, and that's fine, but that's a fact. And he won an election with people knowing that. I think that there are zones of resiliency, there are zones of sustainability, and frankly, I mean, if you look at people who are engaged in things like solar power, if you look at the rise of Tesla, for example, Tesla is an indicator that the use of electric vehicles is drifting towards mainstream behavior and not just the behavior of somebody who's deeply committed to the environment. If we get the kind of, and this is a good example of what I mean by science and technology and engineering, if we get the kind of breakthroughs in batteries that people hope we'll get, you'll have a revolution in the number of people buying electric cars. Now, that doesn't by itself solve everything, but it is an example of the kind of change that I think it will be real and that would probably accelerate under this administration. So part of it is to figure out, are there ways, I used to talk to President Clinton many years ago about this notion of how do you grow green industries. Well, you don't grow them with crony capitalism for projects that don't work, that ultimately fail and are embarrassing. But you can design patterns that encourage people to do things and that move you towards sustainability. And I think that that's totally compatible with where the administration wants to go.
There's another sort of overriding issue, and the group would like some advice from you on what you would recommend if you were a scientist working at a university today, and then similarly, if you were a government scientist, what advice would you offer?
Well, first of all, the concept of, if I was a government scientist, it would depend on where. I think, for example, because of its direct tie to health, that NIH is likely to be fairly protected. And I actually think that NIH can be, there are pieces of NIH you could really rethink, and I worry a great deal about how much peer review has meant too much caution and, frankly, too much weight on people over 40 who know each other well and not enough opportunity for people under 40. I really worry about how much the system has not allowed young people to have the opportunities that they should have. But I think NIH is probably fine, and my hunch is NIST will be fine because it does things that can be explained directly in terms of the environment, and because it's in commerce, and Wilbur Ross is going to be a very, very strong Secretary of Commerce. And once somebody explains to him why it matters, he'll have the muscle to sort of beat up OMB, which is a key part of the game. Having a leader who's capable of going to OMB and saying no is really very powerful. Here's my number one proposal to you as a different way of thinking. A study just came out by a university which estimated that between 11 and 15% of its overhead is federal regulations and federal paperwork. This is an administration which hates paperwork and regulations. It's very entrepreneurial. So one of my advices is go back home, identify the 50 dumbest things you're being required to do, and go to your congressman and say, why don't you wipe these out? Keep my job, and in fact, you may even actually end up with a net increase in available money by getting rid of stuff that currently, it's a little bit like the doctor's office problem, where the doctor has less and less take-home pay as he hires more and more clerks to fill out more and more paperwork, so the federal government has more and more information it doesn't use. And if you could eliminate 50% of the medical doctor's paperwork, the doctor would be happier, they'd spend more time with patients, and they'd have more take-home pay. And I think you're going to see a very serious, when Trump said the other day that he wants to get rid of 75% of the regulations, he meant he wants to get rid of 70. Now, he doesn't know the details, but he wants to get rid of notionally he wants to get rid of 75%. So partly I'd be his ally and say, look, here is a range of really dumb things you require us to do today. And that also includes in the application process, as all of you know, the degree to which the paperwork required, which has been compounded by the rise of laptops and iPads, so you can now require endless volumes of paper because they're all sent in by somebody who stayed up all night filling out endless volumes of paper. Not that it improved the decision making, but boy, do you have a lot of stuff to defend yourself with if it goes wrong. Well, so I'd ask you to look at that part of it too. And then the last thing is, you know, and again, I used to be an assistant professor at a state college in Carrollton, Georgia, when we didn't have very much money. I was the first coordinator of environmental studies, where I had no authority and no power and had to whine to all the departments to loan me faculty. So I kind of understand some of this stuff. Sometimes you're going to have to go to the state legislature, or you're going to have to go to your congressman and say, look, these jobs or this department really matter. Well, again, I don't think that's terrible. I think that having a period where we evaluate what are we doing, and I will just say up front, at the risk of really irritating some of you, every department in the country isn't equally valuable. Every course taught isn't equally valuable. And the degree to which we cannot have any critical thinking about how we allocate resources is not healthy. And so I think that there's a fair amount of trying to think through what should we try to get done, what should we focus on, and I don't think that's bad. I think that it's good for the country to occasionally have this kind of scrutiny and this kind of argument. We spend an enormous amount of money, and we have some right to say to the taxpayer, we have thought it through, it is useful, and we hope that you will decide that this is an investment that improves your life.
There's another issue that looms, and that is the business of nuclear button, or the nuclear power, and issues of managing nuclear weapons. Could you comment on that?
Well, when you first said nuclear power, I was thinking in terms of generating electricity.
No, I'm thinking in terms of weaponry.
Weapon. Look, I believe as a historic matter that we've had a surprisingly good run of minimizing the spread of nuclear weapons, and that ended about 10 years ago. And that we really haven't, I mean, this really worries me a lot. One of the reasons I got in public life was I read a book called Tomorrow by Philip Wiley, which was a description of a nuclear weapon going off in Kansas City. And it was so terrifying. My dad was a career infantryman for 27 years in the Army. But it was so terrifying that the idea of trying to make sure that it never happened struck me as worth spending the rest of my life doing what I'm doing. North Korea, I mean, when people talk about managing it, I have no idea what they're talking about. It's a little bit like when people run up to me, particularly, and say they're really concerned about humanitarian activities, and I look at Darfur, and I look at Srebrenica, and I look at the Palestinian camps, and I look at Syria, and I think we've had a great deal of anguish, but we've had very little effective policy because we're not willing to be honest about what effective policies would cost. Well, you have the same thing happening with nuclear weapons now. I mean, North Korea is certainly making nuclear weapons. They will probably in the near future sell some. I'm actually writing my third novel about terrorism. And it will involve swapping large quantities of oil by a terrorist group for a North Korean weapon. And do I think that's possible? 100%, absolutely. The Pakistanis just launched their second new missile, designed to reach further into India. Do I think, I sat through meetings in 2001 trying to figure out how to communicate to the Indians and the Pakistanis that this would be catastrophic on a scale they couldn't imagine, because they were really drifting towards a nuclear war. The Iranians are going to break out. They're going to build nuclear weapons. 2 nuclear weapons over Israel is the equivalent of what the Germans did with the Holocaust. I mean, we live in a frightening world. And I don't think you can manage it in the way we've tried to with legal diplomatic umbrellas. I think we were lucky to get as far as we did. And I think it's going to require us to have a much grimmer, much more challenging view of defense. When we did the Hart-Rudman Commission, which Bill Clinton and I helped create, And then he asked me to serve on it when I stepped down as Speaker. We spent 3 years. It's the longest review of national security since 1947. We spent 3 years looking at things, and on a bipartisan basis, we said, this is 2001, but it's March, it's before 9/11. We said the greatest threat to the United States is a weapon of mass destruction going off in an American city, probably by a terrorist group. And I was described by Senator Rudman in Senate hearings as the father of Homeland Security because I argued so passionately. Now, I didn't argue for the system we currently have. What I argued for was a system that would practice against 3 simultaneous nuclear events in 3 different cities the same morning. Because today we couldn't cope with one. We have not taken seriously how big this danger is. And I'm probably giving you a grimmer answer than you want. I mean, I think you have to fundamentally back out of our current intellectual framework, confront how real the danger is, how rapidly it's going to spread, and really think through what will it take us to survive in a world where madmen have nuclear weapons, because you're going to live in a world where madmen have nuclear weapons. And I apologize for coming to a happy, optimistic group and being it was her fault for asking the question.
From that point, then, when we as scientists want to give the best advice, want to provide all that we can in terms of knowledge, how do we get that across when it seems that facts don't matter?
Well, I think that attack on President Obama for lying about keeping your doctor and keeping your insurance was inappropriate, and I'm not willing to be partisan and take up that comment. But nor will I comment on Hillary Clinton having explained that eliminating 33,000 emails was not inappropriate. So I want to stick to where we are. One, I actually do think that in a lot of areas, television and the internet really do work, and people do learn, and there's an ongoing national conversation. Two, I want to distinguish between scientists offering advice as scientists about science and scientists offering advice about other things. And a good example is the development of the first atomic bomb. Oppenheimer hated the idea that it would be used, although he was one of the keys to building it. The decision to use it was a political decision involving a calculus by the elected President of the United States. It wasn't a physics decision. The capacity to get it required physicists. The decision to build it was a political decision by FDR, based on advice from Einstein and others. So I think you have to draw a distinction between when do you offer advice that is scientific advice by a scientist about science, and when do you offer a policy advice which you think you're allowed to do because you're a scientist. They're not always the same thing. And that's part of what, frankly, messes up our dialogue about what's science and what isn't science and who's anti-science and who isn't. But I would say to you that, if you remember, you have very small people. Vannevar Bush had an enormous impact by quietly wandering around in World War II and sitting down and talking to people and educating them. And I think that's a key part of this, is to find ways for some people who are very distinguished, who are very good at interpersonal relations, to figure out who the key players are. And you have to go talk to them. You have to think and you have to have something you're telling them that is clear enough to you that you can explain it in a way that it's clear enough to them. Because what they're not going to do is they're not going to get a degree in science. And so if you go back and look at the letter that Einstein wrote to Roosevelt and the scale of the decision Roosevelt made, I mean, I think the Manhattan Project was the second most expensive thing we did in World War II after the B-29. And it was an enormous project. And it was based on one letter and a decision by the president, and then saying to the Congress, we really need it, don't ask questions. And they didn't. They said, we do not want to know. And they funded the whole thing. And it was about 3% of the gross domestic product. So it was pretty big. So I think that's part of it. John F. Kennedy does the same thing. Somebody convinces Kennedy we can get to the moon, and that as a geopolitical device to prove to the Russians that we have an advanced society, we need to do it. He announces it in May of 61, when we don't have any of the things we need to actually do it. We get it done by the summer of 69. It was a very small number of people. And I think that's part of it. You have to figure out who in this vast scientific community knows somebody who knows somebody, so you can go have dinner, or you can go have breakfast, or you can sit down, over a cup of coffee. That's for really large-scale learning, it's absolutely key to be personal and face-to-face, I think.
I know you care a lot about science, technology, math education, STEM education. What kind of investments should we be pushing Congress to make if they're going to make it, and what would you recommend based on your personal interests?
Well, I think this is, again, one of those areas where I think what we've allowed to happen over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly in our poorest neighborhoods, is just tragic. And I think part of it requires rethinking both value systems as well as investments, and it requires rethinking, I think, outcomes. I mean, when you discover that something like 13% of the students in Baltimore pass the 8th grade math test, 87% don't, and you look at the scale we're spending. I mean, if you only measure by the ones who actually pass the math test, we're spending something like $140,000 per pass for each student that passes. Well, there's something profoundly wrong, not moderately wrong, if that's happening. And so I would argue that, but I'm old-fashioned. I mean, I actually think education should center on reading and writing and doing math and learning things that you actually can quantify. And I don't mean by quantify these tests, which I think are idiotic, because all they do is they convince the teacher to teach the test, which teaches the student to know that the whole thing's rigged. So all the student does is get through the test, that nobody learns anything. But they do really well on the test. And that's not how real learning occurs, as all of you know. But I would go back to looking at how do you measure outcomes, and how do you revalue this? So one of the things that they were experimenting with, for example, in some high schools in Indiana, was you could get a letter jacket by doing really well academically, because they're trying to find ways to reestablish a sense of, we currently have a standard where if you're really good at athletics but can't read, it's okay, we'll try to get you through anyway. But if you are brilliant and on the edge of doing graduate level work when you're 9, we wonder why you're being weird. And then we wonder why we're not producing enough people who focus. So I think this is a very fundamental crisis of our culture. We have decayed dramatically since our peak, which is probably in the 50s, early 60s, in terms of being able to produce people who could routinely do things. And that becomes, by the way, a major political problem. You have lots of people out there who don't know anything. We talked about facts. You have a lot of people out there who don't know anything. It really creates an environment where it's hard for facts to matter, because they're not used to dealing with facts. They deal with moods.
I know that time is short, and I've got so many questions.
Why don't you ask the ones you like?
But what we'd like to hear from you, because we're mostly environmental scientists, climate scientists, fundamental scientists here, and we would like to know about sustainability and how we work and how we should work with Congress, with the President, when we do need to spend some time thinking and working to protect our environment.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting topic, which we could have a fabulous debate over. I have even though I taught in the Second Earth Day and I helped organize the environmental studies program, and I originally, when I was very young, I wanted to be either a vertebrate paleontologist or a zoo director. So I'm only doing this stuff because I'm scared. But if I had not been frightened by the scale of the threat to our society, I would actually be off doing things. And one of the fun things that Clifton and I just did, I was telling Rita, we just founded a small, very small, we're not folks with a huge amount of money, but we founded a small vertebrate paleontology fund at the American Museum of Natural History, because I love this stuff, and I think it's really important. I think one of the real tragedies that totally distorted the debate over climate change was that it got tied into the solution in a way that if you accepted the first, you had to accept the second. And I think that was profoundly wrong. First of all, because there are many ways to, let's assume there's going to be climate change, and let's assume a large part of it's is driven by human behavior. You know, Al Gore would have gone around 1200 to the Dutch and explained that lowering the ocean was a national imperative. Because if the ocean kept rising, it was going to inundate Holland. Now, the Dutch, who apparently did not have an Al Gore leader, decided to build dikes as a process of sustainability and adaptability and resilience. And the dikes seem to have worked reasonably well. I don't know how many have been to Holland, but it's a very wealthy country with lots of farmland, and almost all of it's below sea level. So we couldn't even get to that conversation because I was told as a conservative who does not trust centralized government, fears the tyranny of bureaucrats, and doesn't want to be told that we have to adopt an anti-growth strategy because we're not clever enough to grow and have sustainability. It got very hard to even get into the conversation because I'm not willing to accept part B of the step. If I agree to A, I then have to agree to B. And so I'd start from there. Sustainability done correctly is profitable. Resilience done correctly is profitable. I mean, I went to Tulane, and I went back down after Katrina, which was largely a failure of government. I mean, you look at what really went wrong in New Orleans with Katrina, it was all government. It was the local levee board, which was corrupt. It was the Corps of Engineers, which was bureaucratically inept. And it was not inevitable. It was, you know, you didn't have to have that disaster. So part of it is to say, what do we have to do to have real sustainability? What do we have to do to have resilience? What do we have to do to have agility? And I'll close with one, you know, I'm passionate about saving animals. But frankly, saving animals requires wealth. You have a poor enough country, everything becomes game meat, and they kill all of it. Or they poach. You have to be wealthy enough, and you can afford to sustain a lot of stuff you can't sustain when you're poor. And in that sense, I would argue that people who really want to save the environment have a really vested interest in high growth rates because you want everybody wealthy enough that they don't go out and eat the elephant or they don't go out and eat the gorilla. Calista and I, a couple years ago, were very fortunate. We got to climb to about 9,500 feet, actually on the mountain that Fosse had lived on that became part of it, was the Gorillas in the Mist. The people who took us up there were the poachers because they'd all now been hired to be guides. So they're now protecting the gorillas they used to poach from people who now want to poach them, and they actually know how to do it because they were real poachers. And they also knew how to get us to the gorillas, which is kind of cool. But that required a very sophisticated economy in order to sustain that. So in a sense, sustainability in an ideal way, we have to find a way to have sustainability and rising quality of life for human beings compatible. And that also means, candidly, and this was just a terrible moment. I mean, you can't turn to an entire region and say, your entire way of life has to die because I have a theoretical model that in 40 years things are going to be really terrible, and so I actually don't care what happens to your family in your town. And you go and you look, I'll close this, but it's one of the books that really has affected me is called Dreamland by Sam Quinones. It is the story of OxyContin addiction, Mexican heroin, the rise of the new distribution systems, the role of disability in getting a Medicaid card so you can go to corrupt doctors so 3 or 4 of them will give you drugs the same day, and the rise of Walmart as an easy place to steal from. So you can go and steal a microwave, which is worth $200, you get $100 in drugs for it, and the person you give the microwave to then goes back and turns it in for $200. And you read Dreamland, and you're reading about despair. There are 10 million men who are now out of the workforce, gone. They're either addicted, on disability, or playing computer games. And you can't have solutions that say, you know, we're just going to wipe out Western Pennsylvania and all of West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, and I'm sorry, but life's hard and you just got destroyed. Free societies can't sustain that. So I'm very happy to talk about what do we do for sustainability, what do we do to minimize damage from the climate, but I'm not willing to say, therefore, we, the government, are going to impose on you a series of very, very real pain. And that's part of what the coalition that won this election was people who were just screaming. And part of the scream, frankly, is addiction. The book is, if you read this book, you'll be sobered about the challenges we have here in America in a way that I think you'll be very surprised by. It's a very, very big problem. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much, Newt, and I know you'll help us triple the NSF budget. Thank you all for attending.